I should try to start class on time for once. Only because I got here really early to figure out the computer stuff. Jenny, when you join the meeting, I'll make you co-host, okay? Any announcements from anybody? There is another Institute of Politics speaker tonight. It's at what, 6?
Yeah, so tonight there's going to be special guests as well. It's going to be a seminar about the rural urban divide in North Carolina. So former U.S. Congressman Bob Buckridge is going to be there, as well as I think current state senator Don Davis. It's going to be a really interesting conversation to understand sort of the evolution of North Carolina politics, why it currently is the way that it is. Yeah, that'll be at 6 o'clock in Green Law 305.
Oh yeah, so that's Green Law 305, 6 o'clock, discussing urban-rural divide in North Carolina. Yeah, it's a huge issue, not just in North Carolina, but all over the country, and the world for that matter. But we are definitely seeing more and more of a divide there, both in terms of sort of economic progress and politics. So anybody else have a video? I mean, a video, an announcement? Yeah, a video. You want? No. A couple things about class. Remember that problem set 2 is due on Friday. Remember that we will not be meeting in here on Friday. It's probably going to be fairly regular throughout the rest of the semester. That Friday, if we meet here, it'll be a relatively quick sort of application type thing, but probably be a little bit more asynchronous. And there's lots of reasons why. Mostly because I got a lot of requests to make the class as sort of asynchronous as possible, which, whatever. But next week, speaking of not meeting, we don't meet in here at all. Yeah. Isn't that weird? Next week, all of class time is devoted to paper meetings. Okay, and I know that seems like a strange thing to do, but I found that I want to give everybody an opportunity to meet with their grader. And I know that everybody who is registered for this class can meet at this time. What you want to do is look for your grader sign up for next week. It'll be during their regular office hours and during class, at least one day of the week during class. Go ahead and sign up as soon as you can, even if you're signing up for like next Friday. And the reason for that is just to kind of being nice and giving us a heads up as to which papers we need to read first. Because when you've got 35 plus papers, having an order to go through them in is extremely helpful. Okay. I will be posting some short videos, probably some news articles, and some kind of practice questions throughout the week, because that next Monday is your midterm. And I will also hold a review session probably during class on Friday, but it'll be via Zoom. Okay. I will post a study guide for the midterm that will give you the topics that are within the realm of possibility. And my suggestion is to take the study guide, sit down with the PowerPoints, the video lectures if you want, and your lecture notes. Take the study guide and turn it into a full study guide that you're making yourself. There's a lot of evidence out there that shows that if you do it yourself, it is way more effective than using somebody else's study guide. Other things that you can think about, it's more effective if you use handwriting as opposed to typing. But do that. if you have questions after creating your study guide, that's when you want to study with other people. Or that's when you want to ask me or the TA a question. But group studying only works if you've studied before meeting with a group. It's one of those things that I think a lot of people don't necessarily get. I think that's everything in terms of logistics. So today we're gonna keep on going with US political institutions, get as far as we can. Feel free to chime in with questions, examples, what have you. Whatever we don't finish today, I will record and post the rest of the lecture on Sakai. I still don't totally understand the whole Zoom, Panopto, whatever, how those things work together. It's driving me crazy. I've spent hours on it. And hopefully I'll figure that out soon, but there will be something up there that you can watch. All right, so we left off on Monday talking broadly about what the US system looks like in terms of being a constitutional republic with democratic leanings. And we talked, about federalism last time and how that really fragmented power across the United States, creating all these veto points, making it difficult to get large-scale policy change through, especially getting it through quickly, because of the need for compromise and all these veto points. Now we're going to add some more veto points and some more fragmentation of power. And this is through the doctrine of separation of powers. Please work. All right. So we're starting very, very simple here in terms of three primary functions of the government. Right? Very bedrock ideas. And it's just to make laws, to interpret those laws, and to enforce those laws, to execute the laws. In a nutshell, that's what governments do. One of the big questions in governance, trying to figure out how to set up governments to best promote the public good, this can be somewhat tricky, okay? But the basic idea that pretty much everybody agrees on is that you don't want any one person or group having all three of these powers. Montesquieu maybe takes it a little bit far when he says it would be the end of everything, but what's wrong with a little hyperbole from time to time? Definitely, it would be a very, very different situation. But in general, we want these things to be separated. We want these powers to be held by different groups of people. Now, we have what's known as a weak separation of power system. And that's evidenced by the fact that, say, the Supreme Court can rule actions of the president or the Congress unconstitutional, right? It's not a pure separation of powers. In a pure separation of powers, none of the branches would have any control over the other branches. But that is, obviously not the case in the United States. You often hear separation of powers and checks and balances in the same sentence, and people often use them as almost synonyms, and they're not. They're related, but they are different. Okay, you don't have to have the checks and balances that we have in order to have separation of powers. And there's different levels of checks and balances that you could have. But again, what we're talking about is some institution within the government under the Constitution has the power to pass laws regarding immigration. Okay, that's Congress. Then, once they pass those laws, we have some checks. Okay, the president, the executive branch, being responsible for enforcing those laws, has wide discretion in how to do that and how to carry it out. And that's simply a recognition of the reality of scarce resources. And that the president, as the primary entity in charge of foreign affairs, might want to make some decisions on, say, deporting a whole bunch of Haitians that go against what Congress initially said when they were saying who's eligible for deportation. Which, if you're not aware, that is something that we're currently doing, despite really bad conditions in Haiti. You all probably know, some of the basic ones here. I've already talked about them. Most of them come directly from the Constitution, but there are others that don't. We actually have some informal checks and balances. Things like the timing of elections. Things like the fact that in the Senate, only a third of senators are up for election every 2 years. Right? That gives them a little bit more authority to do what they want for 4 years before they have to worry about campaign. We also, little things like having the election on a Tuesday. That can be seen as a check or a balance in a way, not so much a check as it is reducing who can vote. But it's a decision that can be made in some situations outside of Congress. Okay, so we've got these three entities: the executive branch, the legislature, the judicial branch, and some people claim that administrative agencies are essentially a fourth branch, or that the media might be considered to be a branch. We're not going to go with that in this class. What happens, okay, when each of these institutions is governed by people with very different beliefs? Okay, what happens when the government is divided, where Democrats control Congress, the Republicans control the presidency, and theoretically the Supreme Court is neutral, but we all know it's not. So having a divided government can be potentially problematic because of the need for compromise, right? And that kind of thing. And so I want to go through generally what is proposed on a theoretical level to happen when we have divided government. And the reason I'm doing this is historically, and especially in the last 60 or 70 years, the American public seems to like divided government. We don't want the same party in charge of everything. Now that started when Americans were mostly centrist in political beliefs. And that's clearly not the case today. But yet we still tend to see some level of divided government, even if it's the Senate divided 50-50. Yeah. So the major concern here, again, is that the government isn't going to be able to get anything done. So here are the potential outcomes. One, they could actually sit down and talk to each other and come to some kind of agreement, right? Are we going to raise the debt limit? Are we going to include the entirety of the Biden administration's agenda in the same bill as the infrastructure stuff? All of these things, okay, are currently being debated. And depending on what media outlet you read, you'll see Nancy Pelosi either being celebrated or slammed. because she's actually being somewhat pragmatic and at least thinking about the idea of compromising. That is the ideal outcome. Not necessarily with Pelosi and what's going on right now. I'm not endorsing anything there. But from the framers of the Constitution's point of view, this is what they wanted to have happen. Again, to meet in the middle in order to better represent a centrist society. The other extreme there is known as constitutional breakdown, where the entire Constitution is essentially tossed. No one has any faith in it anymore. We decide to have a new constitutional convention. You do hear calls for new constitutional conventions every so often. We've had more of these calls in the last 10 years than we had in the previous 50 combined, probably. None of them particularly serious, but it could happen, right? It very well could happen. And you look at other countries where constitutions have been completely scrapped and redone. We have the world's oldest written constitution. So we've never fully gotten to constitutional breakdown. We've been close. Civil War is an obvious example. The last potential outcome is something that a certain textbook author called crisis in governability. It's sort of a fancy way of saying that what's going to happen is where each party has power, they're going to act in those realms. There's going to be unilateral action. And there's going to be a whole lot of essentially blaming the other side, harassing the other side. You know, saying, hey, I would like, you know, President Biden saying, I would like to do X, Y, Z, but Congress won't do anything. And specifically, Senate Republicans won't do anything. Right? That's blaming the other side and then doing what he can do by himself. You know, I would argue that this is where we've been for a long time now, is in this stage. If you just look at the history of President Obama's actions, he started off trying to go through Congress. He was able to only when Democrats held both houses of Congress, and then couldn't do anything. So he started issuing executive orders. And you saw the same thing with President Trump. And you're sort of seeing the same thing with President Biden. It seems to be the new normal, but it is not the way the system is supposed to be run. It's not the way it was meant to happen. So this is just some data sort of showing the change in the American public and this preference for divided government. So you can see early on, right, you would often have long periods of time where the same party controlled everything. Right, but then you start seeing some differences. Right, you've got Democratic Congress, Republican president. Quick, full authority, then split. Okay, it is mostly going to be split. We can have all kinds of arguments about whether it's a good or a bad thing. I would say for the purposes of this class and for thinking about public policy generally, divided government poses problems to accommodation and compromise. But again, that was the system under which it was thought we could produce the best policy possible. All right, so I talked about divided government. What happens when one party controls everything? And we're really focused on the federal level here. This is sort of a crucial time period in policymaking. And the reason is exactly what we talked about last time. This idea that change is difficult any change that occurs is likely to be incremental. Yeah. And so if they have 2 years of Congress and the White House, and if they got the Supreme Court, even better, they're going to try to get things done as quickly as possible. This is the whole first 100 days idea. And one of the main reasons they do this is what's known as entrenchment. Okay. What does the word entrench mean? Esther?
Like not to budge.
Okay, not to budge. To dig in. Yeah, that's how I always think about it, sort of digging in, and then it's hard to root them out, right? It's hard to retrench is the word that we use. And this is very true when it comes to political institutions. When you can create new political institutions or adapt existing political institutions in order to implement policies that you want, what that does is it creates a whole new set of interests in those institutions and in the public that's going to make future changes to them more difficult. So, you know, a lot of people complained about President Obama really focusing on the Affordable Care Act at the very beginning of his presidency. That was essentially his attempt to entrench that system of healthcare in the United States institutional environment. And guess what? It kind of worked, because it's never been fully repealed. And there are lots of people who now rely on getting insurance through those marketplaces, for example, that are never going to vote for a full repeal. And you know, because he was able to get it in place, even though the Republicans took over Congress for most of the last 6 years of his presidency, it stayed in place, right? How many votes did they have to repeal the Affordable Care Act? It was like 50 something. And it never worked. You saw this with the Reagan administration as well. It tends to be Democrats who are entrenching social programs and Republicans who are trying to retrench them, more market-based solutions. So Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, for that matter, in the UK, in Britain, they had very concerted efforts to try to dig out the formal welfare system in their respective countries. And they both failed fairly miserably because it is just so hard to do. Another thing that they're doing is called racing the constitutional clock. This again gets at that 100 days thing. They know that there's going to be another election for the House and 1/3 of the Senate in 2 years. They also know that the campaign for that is already starting. It's just absurd. Generally speaking, when one party wins the presidency, the other party makes gains in Congress in the next election. So right now, in order for President Biden to take advantage of what is sort of full authority, he really has to get busy. And the longer that Mitch McConnell and others in the Republican leadership can delay this, the better it's going to be for their desired policy outcomes. And that's really what the fight's about right now, is racing this constitutional clock. One thing I failed to mention in terms of an institution that's crucial to all of this that I'm talking about is the fact that we have a two-party system. There's nothing in the Constitution that requires a two-party system. There's nothing anywhere that requires a two-party system. But we have a first past the post election system. Okay, there is no proportionate representation. It's winner take all. In winner take all situations, it is very difficult to have more than two parties. It happens, obviously. We've had parties disappear and new parties emerge to take one of those two spots. But it doesn't happen particularly often. Okay, so what you're seeing are these short bursts of activity. They're really focused on institutional longevity, setting up those interests, entrenching those interests to make it more difficult for the opposition to get rid of it. You also see a whole lot of symbolic policymaking. And the reason here is they're just trying to be like, I told you I would do this, so I'm doing it. Even though they know full well that come the next election, that's probably going to get reversed. Or if they lose the presidency in 4 years, it's going to get reversed. You also see conscious moves to expand power in those branches that are least likely to switch in coming elections. This is one reason why we've seen such a huge growth in the administrative state. Because if you can put more and more power in administrative agencies, you can maintain what you have achieved even after you've left office, based on who you've hired and that kind of thing. Same thing with the judiciary. You know, nobody tends to give President Trump much credit for anything. But one thing that he did very successfully was completely alter the ideological makeup of the federal judiciary in the United States. Okay, any questions on that? And then we're going to get into sort of each branch and just some specific things I want you to know. Just say I had a proud moment on Monday when I was at swim practice with my daughter, and this has nothing to do with my daughter swimming. It's because I finally got a chance to read in detail your bios, and there are 4 of you that actually put down what is inarguably the best TV show, but it's one that nobody ever puts down, and that's Psych. Yeah. That made me so happy. It's hard to even explain how happy that made me. There are some other interesting things on there. I'll share some of the data with you. We had some opposites. One person who's never broken a bone or been stung by a bee. I feel sorry for you when those 2 things happen at the same time. And then we had one person who had broken like both wrists, both ankles, and every other thing that you can think of. We have one former military, which is exciting. What else did I have on here that I wanted to talk about? Somebody who had never used a button to cross the street until college. These are the kind of things you just don't think about until they happen to you, right? Anyhow, I will keep referencing these things as we go on. There's some pretty good ones. There's no kicking in the face, but there are some pretty good ones. And I got to give another shout out to, I'm going to call you out, Jordan. Name of the Wind, fantastic book. If you haven't read it, Patrick Rothfuss, Name of the Wind, really good stuff. Okay. Now that you're completely distracted, let's talk about Congress. I said this before, but I just want to emphasize it because it's not on the PowerPoint. Congress is the most powerful policy-making body that we have, and it was intended that way. Now, the structure of Congress has changed over time, such as senators being directly elected by the people and other things. But what a lot of people don't really get about Congress is that the vast majority of work is done sort of behind the scenes, or at least amongst a few people. And these are the people on committees. It is very hard to get 438 people to do anything. Yeah, so you've got to kind of break it up. And so we have all these committees, they have specialized jurisdictions. Sometimes that's overlapping a little bit, often for political reasons, so they can send it to the ones that they want. Important to understand that one of the biggest benefits of having majority control of the House or the Senate. So just take the Senate, for example, right now. It's 50-50. Republicans, technically it's 50-48 plus 2 for the Democrats, because we got the 2 independents that caucus with the Democrats. That's a tie, but the Democrats are the majority party because of Kamala. And what that means is that the Democrats control the committees. They're going to chair every committee. And those chairs historically have had a ton of power to just sit on bills, to push certain bills. They have the power over who's called in to testify, the evidence that's brought in, all kinds of things like that. And it used to be that having your representative be the chair of a committee was a huge deal. It's still a pretty big deal, but it used to be gigantic. And it was big enough, if you can believe this, that people would often vote for the usually guy at this time, even if he was of a different party, because the benefits that their district could accrue based on that position of power outweighed any ideological differences. So, you know, having a thorough understanding of the committee system offers you a more complex way of deciding who to vote for. But one of the real trends we've seen in power in the federal government over the last 40 some years, and I would argue started in earnestness in 1995 when Newt Gingrich became Speaker of the House with his contract with America, contract for America. I can never remember the preposition there. But what you started seeing at that point in time was power being funneled away from the committee chairs and into the overall body leadership. So the Speaker of the House would really have the most power. And it would be expected that whoever the chair of the Judiciary Committee is would listen to whatever the Speaker of the House wants. It's not the way it used to be. But now that is definitely the case. Party loyalty has become the primary way by which people get these good positions. It used to be seniority, right? The most senior member of the Democratic Party would get his choice of chairs. Now it's much more based on party loyalty. Just know a little bit about how bills are amended. And that just depends on the rules, and there can be different rules for different bills. There are rules committees. But one of the most important things to understand about rules in Congress is that the House of Representatives has to approve a new set of rules every time there's a new House, which is every 2 years. Okay. That doesn't mean they're drastically changing everything every 2 years, but they have to come up with a new set of rules. The Senate does not. The Senate operates on a continuing rule basis. So whatever rules existed prior continue, though they can be modified by the Rules Committee and the full Senate, depending on exactly what it is that they're changing. And there's several places where this matters. And in the Senate with the filibuster is a huge one. We've all heard the term filibuster. A lot of us don't really understand the process, but it's based on this idea that senators have a right to unlimited debate. Okay, it's written in their rules. The Senate is supposed to be the more collegial body where people are given more leniency and that kind of thing, which makes sense because there's only 100 of them compared to 438. So they have the right to unlimited debate. In order to end debate on any particular bill, somebody has to file a motion for cloture, to close debate. In order for that motion to pass, you need 60 votes. So any party that has 40 or more members, and if you can maintain strict party loyalty, you can block any bill, okay, from coming up for a vote, because essentially you're not allowing debate to close, and so therefore you can't have a vote. It used to be that they actually had to debate on the floor of the Senate. This is the classic Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Robert Byrd reading the phone book. There's lots of examples of this. That is no longer the case. They don't make them actually do anything most of the time. But yeah, there's a really good reason for the existence of the filibuster, and that is providing some leverage for the minority party. Remember, our entire system is based around preventing overconcentration of power. And so you want minority interests to have some sort of leverage. And so it was meant for the minority to use in those situations that were super, super important to them. It was not meant to be used on everything that they disagreed with. Okay, that's just not at all the way it was intended. That's the way it started to be used. And that's why now the filibuster can really only be used on regular legislation. Can't be used on any appointees. It can't be used on specific types of legislation. But that is something that is new. And again, I date this to my buddy Newt, who's a PhD historian, by the way. And I'm not sure he actually paid attention to political history. Anyhow, if you want to see the data behind this, couple things here. Over here, these are, okay, the number of cloture votes. So motions to close. And it starts going up right here, 95, 96. And then boom, boom. Whoosh. Yeah. So it's essentially made the Senate into a 60-vote majority body, which it's not supposed to be. And that's just a timeline of reforms if you want to learn the details of when different things went to the wayside. It's all happened in the last 10 years. So for me, it's all still pretty new. It's what y'all grew up with. Any questions on filibuster? All right, let's talk a little bit about who is in Congress, because who is there is important. If they're supposed to be representative of us and our interests, we want to know. So here's just some basic facts of who's who, what the numbers are. Again, Democrats control both House and Senate in terms of chairs of committees and all that kind of stuff. The advantage that Democrats had in the House went down a lot in the last election. So they don't have a whole lot of room right there for what they call like defections, which is a horrible word to use just because you're not voting with your party. It's almost all guys, shockingly. We're getting somewhat better racial representation in Congress. Gender is getting better, but it's nowhere near representative. If you really get into the weeds and you look at things like religion, that is not representative at all. I think that there are two people in Congress that admit to being either atheist or agnostic. And yet that's the fastest growing religion in the United States. Like 35%. And there's reasons why, right? Which is the way we do our elections. It's very hard to get elected if you don't profess some sort of religious belief, even if it's a different religious belief. That's a lot of voters want that. Medical professionals, that's kind of an interesting one. Yeah. So this is who it is. This is the geography of it, which is important to understand when you're thinking about federalism, the relation of federalism and who's in control. It's largely a left coast scenario where the Democrats control the coasts and the Republicans control the middle. Obviously, there are exceptions there. You know, and a lot of it has to do with rural and urban, which is why the talk today is so important. Where Republicans tend to win in rural areas, Democrats tend to win in urban areas. We do have a couple of states that are technically purple in terms of Senate representation, where they have one Democrat and one Republican. That used to be much more common. It used to be very common in North Carolina, but it hasn't happened for quite some time. I always love to sort of see what these pockets are. Does anybody know what these pockets are? Yeah, it's both. It's big cities and universities. And when you can get the combo, like in Milwaukee, where there's a bunch of universities, it can be pretty important. And Nevada is a fascinating state, right? It is sort of technically blue, right? But that's because Nevada has two cities, basically. And only one of them is of a decent size, and that's Vegas. Something like 90-some% of Nevadans either live in Vegas or Carson City. There are lots of cows. Federal government owns 90% of Nevada, the land, and they lease the land to ranchers so that they can graze it. Anybody ever did y'all follow the Bundy situation where he refused to pay and they kicked his cows, I think it was cows, off the land, and then a whole bunch of people showed up with guns, like on the highway overpass, pointing guns at the federal agents. It was pretty sweet. All right, so I do want you to know some basics of what we know from a social scientific point of view about how members of Congress make decisions. And it seems clear that the primary motivation is reelection. That's not necessarily a bad thing, because if they are in fact representative of their constituents, then they ought to get reelected. It can be a bad thing when that's all they care about. And it can be a bad thing when the reason you get reelected has nothing to do with representing your constituents and everything to do with representing specific interests that may not even be in your state. You know, it's mind-boggling to me that we still allow people to contribute to campaigns of candidates in other states, especially for state offices. I mean, why? But we do. There's a whole lot of trying to avoid blame and claim credit. That's human nature. It's especially important to reelection. And that's because people, voters, remember bad stuff a lot better than they remember good stuff. So it's more important for a politician to avoid blame than it is for them to take credit for anything. You know, supposedly they used facts in policy research. Historically, that has definitely been the case. There's a lot of good research out there that shows that policymakers do in fact look at objective evidence. It doesn't mean that it is the deciding factor, however. And I think more and more we're seeing ideology trumping any kind of objective analysis. Log rolling, this is something that has again kind of disappeared. This is when they would trade votes. So the classic example is the food stamp program. When they were debating the creation of the food stamp program in the 60s, the Democrats obviously loved it. The Republicans not as much. And there was specific pushback from the agricultural sector because their products weren't necessarily eligible for food stamps, at least their direct products. So what ended up happening was, to appease agricultural interests, they put the food stamp program within the Department of Agriculture, not Health and Human Services. And when they did that, it bought a lot of the agricultural state Senate votes, and they were able to pass it. You know? All right. So I'll stop there, and I will, upload something about the president and the courts. I'll probably include something either maybe in the same video, but probably separate, about redistricting, because I think it's really important. Otherwise, I hope you have a good rest of your week and weekend, and I will see you in a long time. You're welcome.